and we don't have too much time to go deep into Justice Breyer, but I thought your piece on his characterizing him as not being up to the moment was spot on. I mean, I have some other issues with his work, like on antitrust over the years. He's pretty bad on that. But really, well, you explained, like, what do you mean by that? He wasn't up to the moment.
Well, look, I also have my issues with Breyer in areas of criminal justice, especially. He sometimes would side with the conservatives. But in that piece, I was more talking about his leadership of the liberal bloc, specifically after Justice Ginsburg died. So there is a very well-established role for the most senior justice in the minority bloc on the court to kind of lead their tribe through the deserts and bring them to a place where they can at least make their voice heard, speak collectively and strongly in their anger with the majority, sort of plant a flag and say, this is dangerously wrong, and fight those decisions as fiercely as they can and try to convince the next generation of lawyers to disavow them and reject the majority's philosophy. And Breyer just wasn't good at that. He was temperamentally so modest and restrained and navel-gazing that he never really found his voice as a leader of the liberals. He almost always sounded conciliatory. He was always searching for an elusive compromise that never materialized. He was the opposite of Justice Sotomayor, who will become the new leader of the liberal bloc, who really, took the gloves off and pulled no punches over the last few years. And so I felt like it was his time to step down for many reasons, one of them being he just couldn't be an effective voice for the three-justice minority. He was not doing the job that was required of him in this position.
What is that unwillingness, right? Do you attribute it more to like an old school perspective on how justices should be more ivory tower, almost stenographers, or people who are making decisions that are above these things? Like, is getting down and dirty in the way that Sotomayor is likely to do, is that seen by some generation of justices as beneath the position?
Yes, I think that's part of it. Specifically, the generation of justices who were on the court in the 90s and the aughts. During that period, the court went its longest stretch without any change in personnel, nearly a dozen years. And all of those justices really got to know each other, became friends, settled into their groove. This was when Breyer came of age as a justice. And they were all relatively nice to each other. Yes, Scalia was often barbed and could be nasty, whatever. But I think Breyer just had this conception of the court as a tranquil, collegial, warm place where people could put their disagreements aside and keep the temperatures down and just engage intellectually. And that era is long gone with Kavanaugh and Barrett on the bench. Like, this is not the time to be conciliatory if you are on the left. Neil Gorsuch does not have a conciliatory bone in his body. And Breyer was still playing by the old rules and just couldn't figure out how to address this rising tide of churlishness and rage and aggression that was coming from the right. So I do think it was an older school philosophy and a reflection of his many years where the justices were genuinely collegial to each other and the right bloc wasn't just constantly trying to eat the left bloc's lunch.
And this is more than an aesthetic, right? I mean, because we are entering into a period, and we don't know how long it's going to be. It could be 10 years. It's more than likely probably going to be 20 years, maybe 30 years, where the laws of this country are going to dramatically shift to the right. The ability of government to function in the way that we have grown up with it, frankly, all of us, is going to change. The ability of the federal government to protect people's voting rights is going to change. All of these things are going to change dramatically. I don't think that your average person on the street is going to be aware of it on any given point. There's going to be a little bit of a boiling frog quality. But lawyers who are interested in this and who are pursuing judgeships, they're going to know. So the failure of Breyer to do this is not just about aesthetics, and it's not just about, sort of like, right? It really is about coming out with forceful positions that for lawyers coming up 10, 20, 30 years ago who want to be able to reverse this in the same way that we had justices reverse it in really the 30s, in the 40s, to allow for things like the New Deal and for things like child labor laws and for, a whole host of things that define our society, our modern society today. This is about basically planting seeds and giving, creating branches for future lawyers to undo some of the horrible things that are about to happen in this country for the next 10, 20 years.
I think that's right. And I think one illustration of the problem is that if you go up to an average lawyer or law student and say, like, what is Breyer's legal philosophy? What is his jurisprudential outlook? It's hard to give an answer because he liked to compromise. He liked to do trade-offs and bargains to kind of meet in the middle. He famously did this with Sandra Day O'Connor a great deal. Whereas if you asked about Elena Kagan or Sonia Sotomayor, both of them have very sharply established and entrenched views on the law, which they are not apologetic about, which they stick to even when under fire and in the minority, and that I think help current generations of law students and future generations reject the majority's view and the majority's dogmas and say, no, I agree with Elena Kagan. Administrative agencies have a legitimate right to interpret and enforce federal law to protect us from pollution and fraud and all these other terrible things. Or Sonia Sotomayor, who says, the Constitution protects our bodily autonomy. We must read it to protect individual rights, to protect criminal defendants. That is its first line of defense. This structural stuff about states and federal power, that is political. That is for the other branches to sort out. Breyer did not have any kind of philosophy that was so clear. He kind of bended and shifted. He was an admin law professor for years, but that didn't come out in his writings the way you might expect. It ended up sort of pushing him toward acting like a bureaucrat sitting in some obscure federal agency rather than a justice on the Supreme Court. So yeah, I agree with that take for sure.
And I think people also need to understand that it's almost, I think it's always been this way, in my opinion. But it has become far less obscured and far more intense, that we have almost two parallel tracks of political systems in this country as it exists now. I would argue three. Maybe there's one that is sort of nascent in terms of movement building outside of it. But we have the electoral politics, and we have these sort of almost what is really now, in many respects, another political system that is what we call the legal system. And for the past, 25, 30 years with the Federalist Society, there has been a new force within the legal system that is making it even more, it has changed the rules of the way that law is, adjudicated and in many respects developed, in many respects struck down. And this is why, having someone like a Kagan or a Sotomayor, and I would argue someone to the left of them would be better on a lot of things, but to have people who are providing a trail for the other sort of future judges, right? That's what this is all about.
Yes, and this is something that, William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall did brilliantly throughout the 70s and 80s through the Burger Court and the Rehnquist Court, and planted some flags that later the Supreme Court actually decided, yeah, we need to revisit this, like Bowers v. Hardwick upholding anti-sodomy laws. The dissent in that case paved the way for its reversal years later, and the court adopted the view of the dissent. There's a great line in Lawrence v. Texas, which overturned that decision, where the court says, you know what, the dissenters were right then, they're right today, and we're adopting their view. And I like to imagine that in 20 or 30 years, there will be decisions in which future justices say, Sonia Sotomayor in dissent was right then, she's right today, and we're adopting her view. And you need to have a powerful and clear vision in order for that kind of prescience to emerge from your own opinions. And again, Breyer was liberal for the most part. He voted in a lot of important cases the right way, say marriage equality or anti-sodomy laws or some, administrative state laws, but at the end of the day, he didn't have a vision. He didn't have the prescience. And I think that several people on Biden's shortlist do and several don't. And I'm just really hoping that we learn more about them and Biden whittles down the options very wisely with this particular issue and this particular foresight in mind.
All right, let's talk about those options. And I just have to add, had Breyer had what you bemoan he lacks, he would have announced his retirement this time last year,
Absolutely.
in my opinion, because he would have understood what's happening with the court and how important it is. And, knock on wood, we have Ben Lujan out right now. There is no effective, we couldn't confirm somebody today. Hopefully we'll be able to in a matter of weeks.